of the people, the angels who have been lost from heaven, because of course 1/3 of heaven's angels have been thrown out. We saw in an earlier lecture why, right? Of course, the how. This one you want to put a star next to, because Milton, as a philologist, as a lover of language, interestingly does not really ever pick up this question. How was creation done? The spoken word. Of course, if you are an inquisitive mind, you might want to ask the question, if language is what creates, then what language? Well, language was spoken in the creation. Again, kind of fascinating. Now, let's remind, before we get into our levels, the 3 levels of reading. Level 1, what does the text say? Level 2, what does the text mean? Here we divide into themes, messages, and of course rhetoric at 2b. Not what the poet says, but how the poet says it. And then finally, level 3, how do I relate? How do I relate this to other texts? How do I relate it to the world? How do I relate it to myself? Remember, as we have said in earlier lectures, we are studying Paradise Lost from 3 primary perspectives. You could do it from many others. We are just concentrating on 3 for our lectures. Paradise Lost is epic. For example, in book 7, we're going to have the 3rd example of what we will call the invocation of the muse. Why does Milton feel the need to do this again? We'll try and answer those questions. 2, we'll study Paradise Lost from the philosophic and the theological perspective. For example, we've already talked about epistemology and the notion of the study of knowledge and what you can actually know. For example, if we were to think about the epistemological position, as we said in an earlier lecture, there's fundamentally 3 positions one can take about what one knows. There's the absolutist position, I absolutely know, and if you don't agree with me, everyone who doesn't agree with me is wrong. The extreme opposite of that is the relativist position. There is no truth, there are no absolutes. Of course, the problem, as we pointed out, is what we call the performative contradiction. To say there are no absolutes is to posit at least one absolute, and the relativist position, in the extreme position, falls on itself. Which is why some people rush back to the absolutist position. But of course, there's a 3rd position, and it's what we'll call in our discussions the fallibilist position. Some have called this, of course, the science position. That is to say, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. Right? Until I find data that disproves my position, I'm going to go ahead and continue to operate from a position of epistemological certainty, but I'm always going to begin from the premise I could be wrong. That is not a position of dogma, for example. Now, of course, science becomes dogma, and it will no longer challenge itself. That we will usually refer to as scientism, which is, of course, just another extreme form of absolutism, as we've said in earlier lectures. How about this for a question? How does the fallibilist question or think about origins? Right? We've already been introduced to the philosophy of oops, don't ask. But of course, Wilber's going to argue that's more of an absolutist position, just don't ask the question. What about the question, though, and why it's important, will be challenged. For example, think of this. Milton would argue that your view of yourself, what we call ontology, is tied to your understanding of creation. Many have argued this, by the way. Certainly, St. Augustine argued this way as well. For example, Raphael, in speaking to Adam and Eve in Book 7, is going to be saying, without actually ever necessarily coming out and saying it to both of them, you are very special because you were created special. Finally, we will look at Paradise Lost from its political perspectives. We'll ask, again, from the psychological and the sociological perspectives, as we said in earlier lectures. For example, notice from the psychological, the individual mind. Notice that it's Adam in these different books, in the conversations with Raphael, who is asking questions. And in fact, sometimes readers have wondered, is Eve even there? We're going to find out that she is there. Adam is the seeker, as we maybe see it. From a sociological perspective, though, the obvious question is, and again, this takes us back to our study of the patriarchy from earlier lectures, where is Eve? And why is she so silent for so much of this exchange? Wow. That's a lot of introduction. I feel like, though, it's an important part of our being able to read and study this. Right? Again, I've said it, some find this book kind of boring, Book 7, and even out of place, but I don't see it that way at all. In fact, I think this is central to Milton's project of justifying the ways of God to men, back to the original invocation. So let's begin by being entertained. Again, there's tremendous joy in Milton's poetry. We're going to hopefully see that, and I hope that I can translate that on to you guys. And then as well, let's be challenged, right? Again, why is there something instead of nothing? It's an interesting 3B question. We'll finish the lecture by asking that. Why are you here? Are you here for some special purpose? And if so, how would you know that? Well, let's begin at level 1. And as we have done with our earlier books, we start with the argument, that is to say, the kind of summary. And so let's do that, and then let's just provide a quick plot summary. Now, just to remind, we've just been told in our previous lecture about the ways in which Satan has been thrown out of heaven, and that explains then why it is that Adam and Eve better be careful. But now we're going to get a request on the part of Adam. Hey, tell me where I came from. That is to say, give me a cosmogonic myth. Tell me where I came from. Explain the unexplainable. Let's read the argument. Raphael, at the request of Adam, relates how and wherefore this world was first created. That God, after the expelling of Satan and his angels out of heaven, declared his pleasure to create another world and other creatures to dwell therein, sends his Son with glory and attendance of angels to perform the work of creation in 6 days. The angels celebrate with hymns the performance thereof and his reascension into heaven. It's not a long book, but there's a lot that happens here. And of course, most of it is really just a retelling of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Now, in an earlier lecture, we of course read Genesis 3. And already we're beginning to see how much Milton amplifies Genesis 3. Of course he will amplify Genesis 1 and 2 as well. He will conflate them in some ways. He will expand beyond them in a number of ways that will be significant and important for us. All of those we want to point out as being significant and important for us as we go forward. All right, so here we go. Let's do a real simple plot summary, Book 7, and then we'll get on into the reading itself. 3 important things. 1, Milton begins with a third invocation to the Muse. I think there's a reason for that, and one of the arguments I'm going to make later in the lecture is I think he was deeply concerned about the work he was doing here. I think he knew that religious readers of his day would be somewhat uncomfortable about some of the license that he was taking with, for example, the cosmogonic story of origins. Then, number 2, Adam will request this cosmogonic myth, this story of origins. And Raphael will then give a poetic rendering, of course it's Milton's poetry, of Genesis 1 and 2, the very thing that we just read. Again, well, pay attention to the additions and the subtractions as we read through this book, especially now that we have the background. Let's begin with just the beauty, again, I like to do this, of Milton's poetry. Let's go now and just look at this invocation, the first 70 lines or so. And let's just play this game of enjoying it. He begins, Descend from heaven, Urania, by that name if rightly thou art called, whose voice divine following above the Olympian hill I soar. We're back to soaring again, back to the original invocation. Above the flight of Pegasus wing. Of course, you know about Pegasus and Bellerophon. If you don't, you can do a bit of Googling on it. The meaning, not the name, I call, for thou, nor of the Muses 9, nor on the top of old Olympus dwellest, but heavenly born, before the hills appeared or fountain flowed, thou with eternal wisdom didst converse, wisdom thy sister, and with her didst play in presence of the Almighty Father, pleased with thy celestial song. Now, Urania is the Roman muse of astronomy, and so really all Milton is saying here is heavenly muse. It's a way to think about it. Notice we've got more flying, and of course he's referencing the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, the very Spirit that was referenced in Genesis 1, moving on the face of the deep. Upled by thee into the heaven of heavens, I have presumed an earthly guest, and drawn inferior air, thy tempering. With like safety guided down, return me to my native element, lest from this flying steed, Pegasus, unreined as once Bellerophon, though from a lower clime, dismounted on the alien field, I fall, erroneous there to wander, and forlorn. In other words, he begs that he will not have a fall himself in telling about the great creation story. He says it, erroneous there to wander and forlorn, half yet remains unsung. He realizes he's at the midpoint of Paradise Lost now, beginning Book 7. But narrower bound within the visible diurnal sphere, standing on earth, not wrapped about the pole, more safe I sing with mortal voice, unchanged to hoarse or mute, though fallen on evil days, he repeats it, though fallen, and evil tongues in darkness, and with dangers compressed round and solitude. Now, there's two readings of this. Milton could be obviously speaking about his own blindness and his own self-doubts, maybe at times, about finishing this great poem. He could as well, of course, be talking about what England is like now. He's beginning already to maybe get a sense that a skepticism is starting to become more clear. Matthew Arnold will talk about it, of course, in Dover Beach, as we've lectured. The sea of faith was once two at the full, and round earth's forelayed like the folds of a bright girdle furl, but now I only hear its long withdrawing melancholy roar. That idea that there comes a moment when, as Yeats will say it in Second Coming, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. And Milton's already maybe feeling this way. Yet not alone, while thou visitest my slumbers nightly, or when morn purples the east. Still govern thou my song. Let's just point out, Milton's father was a acclaimed amateur musician, and Milton is going to have a lot of singing in Paradise Lost, especially in this chapter. It's one of the reasons why I love to read this chapter. It's so musical, it's so beautiful, it's full of joy. Still govern thou my song, Urania, and fit audience find, though few. We think of Francis Bacon's Remember Enough Studies, some few books to be completely digested. Here he says, he seems to be suggesting there may be a lot of people that maybe disagree with my Paradise Lost, but some few I hope that I can find. But drive far off the barbarous dissonance of Bacchus and his revelers, the race of that wild rout that tore the Thracian bard and Rindope, where woods and rocks had ears to rapture, till the savage clamor drowned both harp and voice. The tale, of course, of if you want too much knowledge, it can be dangerous. That stands behind much of this invocation. We want knowledge, but Milton is suggesting we need knowledge with discipline, with reserve, with some understanding that it can be very dangerous, right? He says it. To rapture till the savage clamor drowned both harp and voice, nor could the muse defend her son. So fail not thou who thee implores, for thou art heavenly, she an empty dream. Say, goddess, what ensued, when Raphael, the affable archangel, had forewarned Adam, remember this is the very end of book 6, by dire example, to beware apostasy. By what befell in heaven to those apostates, lest the like befall in paradise to Adam or his race, charged not to touch the interdicted tree, if they transgress and slight that sole command, so easily obeyed amid the choice of all tastes else to please their appetite, though wandering. We're back to this idea of sin as a kind of wandering. He and his consorted Eve, the story heard attentively. And so, for the first time here, we get the mention of Eve. I mean, we've wondered, where has she been? She's been there the whole time. She's not asking any questions. She's just listening. Adam is the one that will ask questions. And Eve was filled with admiration and deep muse to hear of things so high and strange, things to their thoughts so unimaginable as hate in heaven and war so near the peace of God and bliss, with such confusion, but the evil soon driven back, redounded as a flood on those from whom it sprung, impossible to mix with blessedness. Whence Adam soon repealed the doubts that in his heart arose. Knowledge often begins with doubts. And now led on, yet sinless, with desire to know what nearer might concern him, how this world of heaven and earth, conspicuous first began, when and whereof, created, for what cause. We're obviously going through those questions. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. What within Eden or without was done before his memory, as one whose draw yet scarce allied, still lies the current stream, whose liquid murmur heard new thirst excites. Proceed thus to ask his heavenly guest. A couple of observations here really quickly. Notice that the longing for knowledge is like thirst. We think of Emily Dickinson's poem, success is counted sweetest by those who ne'er succeed to comprehend a nectar requires sorest need. It is the one who is most thirsty that actually understands the value of drink. And here, of course, we're playing with that very notion, that word picture. Notice, for Milton, it isn't that there's something wrong with the desire for knowledge. It's rather inappropriate knowledge. Knowledge, but knowledge within reason. Of course, to some degree, we could think of how this squares with Plato's view of justice and temperance, balance, harmony, and all of that. Well, okay, so we now continue with Adam's request. He says it to Raphael, lines 70 through 108. Great things and full of wonder in our ears, far differing from this world, thou hast revealed, divine interpreter. By favor sent down from the Empyrean to forewarn us timely of what might else have been our loss, unknown, which human knowledge could not reach, for which to the infinitely good we owe immortal thanks, and his admonishment receive with solemn purpose to observe immutably his sovereign will, the end of what we are. In other words, he says, we have listened to what you have said and warned us, and we will not disobey. Of course, the dark irony here, and there's foreshadowing all the way through this, is we know how the story ends because, of course, we know what Genesis 3 is all about, right? But since thou hast vouchsafed gently for our instruction to impart things above earthly thought, which yet concerned our knowing, as to highest wisdom seemed deign to descend now lower and relate, what may no less perhaps avail us known, how first began this heaven which we behold, distant so high, with moving fires adorned innumerable, the stars. And this which yields or fills all space, the ambient air, wide interfused, embracing round this florid earth, what cause moved the Creator in his holy rest through all eternity, so late to build in chaos, and the work begun, how soon absolved? If unforbid, thou mayest unfold what we not to explore the secrets yet ask of his eternal empire, but the more to magnify his works, the more we know. In other words, if we can only get this bit of knowledge, we'll even have more reason to worship God. And the great light of day yet wants to run much of his race, though steep. Suspense in heaven held by thy voice, thy potent voice he hears, and longer will delay to hear thee tell his generation and the rising birth of nature from the unapparent deep. Or, if the star of evening and the moon haste to thy audience, night with all her will bring silence, and sleep listening to thee will watch. Or, we can bid his absence till thy song end. Notice he talks about this instruction as a song, and dismiss thee ere the morning shine. In other words, Adam is almost like a child saying, just a little bit more, just a little bit more. I just want a little bit more information. If God will allow it, I would very much like to know what it is that is the answer to the question, Schilling's question, why is there something instead of nothing? Starting at line 109, Raphael will give his warning, and we'll begin now at line 109. Thus Adam, his illustrious guest, besought, and thus the godlike angel answered mild. Quote, this also thy request with caution ask, obtain. Though to recount almighty works, what words or tongue of seraph can suffice, or heart of man suffice to comprehend? Yet what thou canst attain, which best may serve to glorify the Maker and infer thee also happier, shall not be withheld thy hearing. Two observations. One, there is stuff we can talk about. We call that linguistic. There's stuff that cannot be talked about, can't be explained. We call that translinguistic. These are terms, of course, that we've used before. Raphael will say, there's a lot I can't explain to you just because you wouldn't understand it. Notice, he says, however, I will to help you glorify the Maker and also to be happier. We were just mentioning Jefferson earlier, and that whole notion of the Creator, endowed by their Creator. Remember that one, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is going to be a major, major idea in the scientific enlightenment, of which, of course, Milton is in many ways prophetic, and here he says it, right? He says, I'm not going to withhold it from your hearing. Such commission from above I have received to answer thy desire of knowledge within bounds. Let's write it in our notes. That's pure Milton. Knowledge within bounds. Circumspect knowledge, right? Beyond that bound, beyond, abstain to ask, nor let thine own interventions hope things not revealed, which the invisible King, only omniscient, hath suppressed in night. To none communicable in earth or heaven, again we're back to this translinguistic idea, enough is left beside to search and know. To search and know, of course, reminds us of Tennyson's Ulysses, to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bounds of human thought. But knowledge, to continue with Milton, is as food, and needs no lesser temperance over appetite, to know and measure what the mind may well contain. It's an interesting word picture, and it takes us back to the notion that knowledge is like drinking, knowledge is like eating. You can eat, and that's good, and you have to, but you can overeat, and that is bad. Okay? Notice he continues, oppress else with surfeit, and soon turns wisdom to folly, as nourishment to wind. This is interesting, nourishment to wind. This is one of those high moments when Milton plays a very interesting game. He says if you overeat, you have gas, and you will. Right? You will fart. And he says folly is kind of like that one. In other words, too much knowledge of silliness can lead to folly, and therefore intellectual or spiritual farting. I hope that we won't be accused of doing that here. But I love that line. I mean, this just shows you how Milton is having fun all the way through. To continue now, starting at line 139, where Raphael continues with his song. I call it a song because it's like a poem all the way through. And we have God's speech to his son, starting at roughly line 139 to 173. At least our envious foe hath failed, right? God is speaking to the son, who thought all like himself rebellious, but whose aid this inaccessible high strength, the seat of deity supreme, us dispossessed, he trusted to have seized, and into fraud drew many whom their place knows here no more. In other words, Satan rebelled, and a lot of angels got thrown out of heaven. Yet far the greater part have I kept, I see their station. I still got a lot of angels. Heaven yet populous retains number sufficient to possess her realms, though wide, and this high temple to frequent with ministries due and solemn rites. But lest his heart, Satan's heart, exalt him in the harm already done, to have dispeopled heaven, my damage finally deemed, I can repair that detriment. In other words, very simply, he says it, I am going to create a race of people that will be able to re-people heaven. But he makes the observation that Eden, the world, will be a testing ground of a kind. So, Milton is now answering one of the